My life in the small town of Fairview had always been calm but peaceful. I am John, an ordinary man, and my routine consisted of working at the local hardware store, tending my garden, and occasionally socializing with my neighbors. Fairview was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's name, and a warm smile was a constant. I lived alone in a modest house, inherited from my parents, and never thought much about changes or extraordinary events. On a sunny spring day, while walking home, I noticed something strange. Mr. Smith, my longtime neighbor, was in his garden, but he looked different. His face was covered by a brown leather mask with silver details and a disturbingly wide smile. Mr. Smith was a reserved man, but always cordial. At that moment, his presence emanated a disquiet that made me stop. "Mr. Smith, what is that on your face?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He turned slowly, the smile on the mask seeming to widen. "It appeared on my porch this morning, John. Isn't it fantastic?" he said, his voice cheerful, but with an artificial tone. That unsettled me. I had never seen a mask like that before, and the way he talked, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, sent a chill down my spine. We continued to chat for a few minutes, but the mask and that fixed smile remained on my mind. As I walked through the town, I noticed a few more people on the streets, all with similar masks. Miss Laura, the teacher who was always so sweet with the children, now had an expression that wasn't hers. A couple in the park, usually so loving and genuine, wore identical, strangely euphoric smiles. Something was very wrong in Fairview, and I knew I had to find out what was happening. In the following days, the situation in Fairview only got worse. More and more people appeared with those masks. I passed by the elementary school and saw Miss Laura, always so warm and welcoming, now with that fixed smile, so different from her usual face. In the park, I observed a couple I had known for years, now also with masks. They seemed strangely euphoric, laughing and hugging exaggeratedly. The change was not just an appearance. It was as if the essence of people had been altered. Spontaneity had disappeared, replaced by a constant and artificial happiness. I began to notice that social interactions in the town were becoming increasingly disturbing. The masked people not only smiled, but also spoke with forced enthusiasm, as if they were participating in a play where everyone had memorized the same lines. At work, the situation became even more unsettling. First, some colleagues started wearing the masks. Then my boss, Mike. He was a practical and rational man, but there he was, with that mask, talking about productivity with forced enthusiasm. The response was always the same when we asked about the masks. It simply appeared on my porch. The office routine turned into a parody of happiness, with all the masked people acting as if they were in a television commercial. My discomfort grew each day. I felt constantly watched, as if the masked people knew I still didn't have my own mask. Their fixed smiles followed me everywhere, making it impossible to relax. I started avoiding public places and spending more time at home, trying to understand what was going on. Every time I went out, I felt the masked gazes fix on me, as if I were an anomaly in a world of conformity. One night, I returned home and found a mask on my own porch. It was identical to the others, with the same wide smile and silver details. The urge to put it on was strong, as if an invisible force was pulling me, but I resisted. I stored the mask in a drawer, determined not to wear it, but its presence in my house made me uneasy. It was clear that Fairview was no longer the peaceful town I knew, and I needed to find the origin of these masks before it was too late. I spent sleepless nights scouring the internet, trying to find any information about those masks. Nothing. It was as if they didn't exist outside of Fairview. The feeling of isolation grew. I needed to talk to someone, but everyone I knew was under the mask's effect. I decided to visit my friend Sarah, who lived in a neighboring town and hadn't been affected yet. Visiting Sarah was a temporary relief. I explained the situation, and she listened attentively, without judgment. Together, we tried to find any connection, any clue about the mask's origin. We talked late into the night, but reached no concrete conclusions. We promised to keep in touch, and she asked me to be careful. Returning to Fairview, the town seemed even more sinister. The masks were now on almost every face I encountered. The masked people greeted me with an enthusiasm that seemed increasingly threatening. I felt like I was being pushed to the edge of a cliff, and the loneliness of my fight against the masks made everything more desperate. Days passed, and my isolation increased. More and more, I avoided human contact. When I needed to go to the market, it was a terrifying experience. All the customers and employees wore the masks, their static smiles following me down the aisles. I hurried to make my purchases and left as quickly as possible, feeling the weight of those gazes follow me to the exit. At home, the mask in the drawer seemed to have a presence of its own. Sometimes, I felt it calling me, a silent voice whispering in my mind, trying to convince me to put it on. I fought against this urge, knowing that once I gave in, there would be no going back. I decided to hide the mask in the basement, hoping that the physical distance would help silence its calls. Each night, the feeling of being watched grew. It wasn't paranoia. The masked people frequently passed by my house, looking at my windows with those disturbing smiles. I started locking all the doors and windows, creating barriers between me and the rest of the town. Fear became my constant companion, and every sound out of place made my heart race. One night, I woke up startled by loud banging on the front door. The sound was insistent, almost frantic. I got up, heart pounding, and went to the window to peek. What I saw chilled me to the bone. My masked neighbors were gathered in my yard, their smiles wider and more malevolent than ever. That same disturbing smile was plastered on every face, but now there was something sinister, a malevolence that hadn't been there before. As the banging continued, I realized I couldn't ignore what was happening. The entire town seemed to have turned against me, and I was completely alone. The feeling of isolation was overwhelming, but the fear of being captured and forced to wear one of those masks drove me to act. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife I could find. The banging on the door echoed through the house, each one resounding like a premonition of what was to come. I knew I couldn't escape. Every exit was blocked by the masked people. I remembered the basement, and without thinking twice, ran down there, closing the door behind me. The basement was dark and damp, but it offered a temporary sense of safety. I tried to calm my breathing, listening to the banging intensify. It seemed like they were about to break down the door. While hiding among boxes and old furniture, I thought about the past weeks and how everything had changed so drastically. That peaceful town, where everyone knew each other, was now a living nightmare. The masks had transformed people I knew and loved into unrecognizable beings. And now they were there, trying to force me to join them. The banging finally ceased, but the tension in the air was palpable. I heard whispers and muffled laughter outside, as if they were conspiring about the best way to capture me. The knife in my hand was cold and heavy, but it was the only thing that gave me a sense of control. I knew that if they managed to get in, my only chance would be to fight. Suddenly, I heard a different sound, like someone trying to open one of the windows. My heart raced. What would they do if they got in? I positioned myself behind a stack of boxes, the knife firmly gripped. Time seemed to drag on as I waited, each second an eternity. The silence was only broken by the occasional sound of footsteps and whispers outside. The invasion began with a crash. Loud noises echoed through the house, heavy footsteps moving upstairs as they searched for me. Objects fell and doors slammed, each sound bringing a new wave of panic. The fear intensified with each passing second, and I knew they were getting closer. Finally, I heard the footsteps descending the basement stairs. The door gave way with a violent crack, and the masked intruders poured into the space. The group advanced, their fixed smiles even more disturbing up close. I prepared to fight, knowing this was my last chance. The first masked person to approach received a stab in the chest, but to my surprise, he showed no sign of pain. Instead, he continued to advance, the wide, terrifying smile unchanged. Panic overtook me as the other masked individuals quickly approached. I felt cold, firm hands gripping my arms, immobilizing me. No matter how much I struggled, it was futile. Their combined strength was overwhelming. In a last desperate effort, I tried to kick and bite, but they were relentless, as if driven by a unified will. One of the masked individuals held the mask I had hidden. The wide smile and silver details looked even more sinister under the dim basement light. I tried to turn my head, but they held it firmly. When the mask was placed over my face, a shiver ran down my spine. The moment the mask touched my skin, an overwhelming euphoria took hold of me. A wave of pure happiness, something I had never felt before, flooded my senses. It was as if all my worries and fears had been instantly swept away. I felt a lightness and a contentment so profound that it seemed impossible to resist. What remained of my old self was slowly consumed by this new sensation. I vaguely remembered who I was, but these thoughts were quickly suppressed by the overwhelming joy. The faces of my captors, now my companions, were friendlier. The fear was replaced by a sense of belonging, an unbreakable connection to the community of the masked. I looked around, seeing everything with new eyes. I smiled at the others, and they smiled back, no longer as threatening strangers, but as friends. The mask was not a prison, but a key to a new world of unconditional happiness. Finally, I was part of the community of the masked. The resistance I had maintained for so long seemed foolish and pointless. Instead of fighting against this new reality, I embraced it wholeheartedly. And so, with a fixed smile and a light heart, I embraced my new life, where artificial happiness became my only truth.